Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. The organizational team has been really excellent, and thanks also to Steve and Nita, who's not in the room, but is a fine friend and mentor of mine, and also co-leads the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. So it's been really great for me as a Southerner to come up. This is only the second time I've ever been in the Northwest Territories. I've read a lot about it, and so it was really great to hear directly about some of the projects that have been going on, the innovation and the energy here in the Northwest Territories around Indigenous-led conservation. Over a year ago, just over a year ago, I was in the mountains of Burma, giving a talk as they invited me to give a talk at this opening and this launch of the Saluine Peace Park, which is an Indigenous-led, declared peace park on the border of Thailand and Burma, led by the Karen people. So I was speaking about the long overdue shift in conservation practice globally, right? Where increasingly there's this awakening, which we've spoken about a little bit already these last couple of days, this awakening to the leadership that Indigenous peoples have always shown in cultivating healthy ecosystems and fostering healthy connections between society and the land and society and the inhabitants of that land. So Indigenous people are increasingly declaring Indigenous protected and conserved areas, as we call them here in Canada, territories of life, Indigenous protected areas, and so on. There's many words for them. And mainstream conservation is finally, globally, taking notice, and finally, learning how to support that movement. But as important, Indigenous people around the world are also taking notice. And the 700 or 800 Karen people who'd walked for days to get to this launch of this really important park for them were inspired and emboldened by what they heard was happening here in Canada, here in the Northwest Territories, and around the world. So I tell you this first to congratulate you on the new legislation, the energy, the creativity, the commitment, the innovation that is happening in this space, and also to impress upon ourselves and remind us, as we've already been reminded a few times in the last 2 days, that the world is watching us and that we have a collective responsibility to take advantage of this opportunity and to get it right? And to demonstrate the potential of Indigenous-led conservation. And you've already started to demonstrate it, so some of it's about just getting that story out as well, right? So I'm here largely because I'm the co-lead of this Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, and I'm sort of the university hub of that partnership. And what we're really collectively trying to do is support the movement away from kind of old school colonial models of conservation towards models that are rooted in Indigenous knowledge systems, Indigenous law, and Indigenous governance. And so I'm here largely to have learned from you, and I continue to learn from you to find out what's happening here, how we might be able to support that. And I'm also here, as Kathy suggested, to sort of open this session on research. And I want to talk a little bit about the partnership and how we're trying to do things a little differently in that realm. Before I get into the kind of details of what we're trying to collectively do as a partnership and who's involved, I do want to unpack a few loaded words in my title. Research, it's kind of loaded, conservation, also a little loaded, and reconciliation. So I just want to help explain what I mean by those words. So in a book called Decolonizing Research, Smith says, this is a rather famous phrase now, the word itself, research, is probably one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world's vocabulary. So I'm not going to beleaguer this point, because most of you here have known this and lived it. So research is often extractive, the benefits and data going entirely to outside researchers, the findings are often inaccurate, incomplete, ask the wrong questions, and in the worst cases, the findings are used against the very people who shared that knowledge in the first place. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission asserted rightly that research and science have been used to support racist and colonial views, and that the racist and colonial views that European civilization and Christian religions are superior to Indigenous culture and spirituality, right? So effectively, science and research have been used to justify the perpetuation of colonial control over land. And even now, individual researchers who want to use those same tools to advance Indigenous goals, I would argue they can't do that without also engaging Indigenous science, Indigenous ways of knowing, and by transforming the institutions that have claimed to be the gatekeepers of what is recognized as legitimate science. So in short, conventional Western models of research don't cut it. So I often joke that if research is one of the dirtiest words, then conservation might be the second one. So lucky me, I was like, geography is like the ultimate colonial science, and now I do work on conservation. So this kind of captures it. First, we were dispossessed in the name of kings and emperors. later in the name of state development, and now in the name of conservation. And that was said in 2003 at an international forum. So as we've talked about, and Stephen mentioned the other day, Western models of conservation are about separation, right? The goal of colonialism was to disconnect people from their territories. In the Canadian context and around the world, classic parks and protected areas were a tool to make this happen, to dispossess people, take away responsibility. So the very word contains the imagination. People tend to think of wilderness, human-free wilderness, where use is seen as inherently destructive. So there's lots of work then to get people to think about conservation differently, right? As a sum total of all of the activities and issues that we've spoken about here today and yesterday. Reconnecting to land, learning from land, building relationships, economies, and governance that are actually centered on our collective responsibility to the land and its inhabitants. So conservation based in natural law. So put bluntly, a conservation isn't about saving the last of nature from humans, but rather cultivating a healthy relationship between nature and humans that results in abundance. This is effectively what territories of life are about. And finally, reconciliation. At its most basic, in the TRC is understood as an ongoing process of establishing and maintaining respectful relationships. So as Danica mentioned yesterday, this reconciliation is being deeply questioned right now, and rightly so, and it's an increasingly fraught question. So in order to cope with the fact that the whole partnership has that word in the title, I'm reminded that reconciliation isn't just a nation-to-nation event, but it's rather about reconciliation between humanity and the earth, first and foremost, between society and land. Has to happen before we can start to reconcile Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, as well as, of course, nation-to-nation, Indigenous crown and crown governments. So the Conservation to Reconciliation Partnership is really thinking about reconciliation first and foremost as bringing about reconciliation between humanity and the land, which is long overdue, and between all different areas of society and amongst ourselves. As one of the leadership team, Lisa Young, was Mi'kmaq from Nova Scotia, put it, reconciliation has to happen. It can happen lots of different ways and probably has lots of different pathways, all of which need to happen at the same time. But conservation can only really happen through reconciliation. There's really only one pathway to conservation here in Canada. So what does this mean then for research? So Deb McGregor, who's the Canada Research Chair and Indigenous Environmental Justice and an Anishinaabe scholar at York University, and she's one of the leads, research leads on our partnership, coined this phrase, reconciliation research. She starts by saying that when Justice Sinclair was asked, so what's the one thing that non-Indigenous folks should take away from the TRC, his response was that we need to put the relationship back into balance. So when it comes to research, that means privileging research that's formulated from Indigenous knowledge systems, worldviews, and theories. So it doesn't mean treating them as equal. It means privileging research that starts from Indigenous theory, Indigenous knowledge, and Indigenous worldviews. And it also means that we need to critically and carefully build research partnerships that are forged in ethical space. So these are the kind of, So this kind of thinking over the last decade or so has led to kind of a really common mantra, which many of you may have heard, which is nothing about us without us. Us is not me in this instance, us as Indigenous peoples around the world saying, no, we're not going to do research on us, about us, without us. And so I think there's a number of kind of common principles that underlie a lot of the various different approaches to Indigenous-led research, research that is rooted in Indigenous knowledge systems and so on. One of them is reciprocity. So this is what we'll talk about a bit more in the panel, kind of co-learning, co-production, and co-benefits, and ensuring that researchers who don't come from an Indigenous knowledge system, who are working in a realm of Western science, are really creating systems and helping to co-create systems that give rise to co-learning, co-production, and co-benefits. This is a lot of what OCAP is talking about, and I think in the second panel this afternoon we'll talk specifically about OCAP. Respect for different ways of knowing, obviously. Respect for each other, for our governance systems, and for our knowledge systems. And so this reflects a term, two-eyed seeing, which was made popular and developed by Albert Marshall, who's a part of our Elders Lodge, also Mi'kmaq. And the other is reverence. So knowledge is sacred, and it has to be treated with integrity. Every nation has different kinds of protocol in terms of who gets to access, what gets said, what gets told, to whom, under what conditions. And we need to respect that and uphold it. So these are the kinds of principles that are guiding the research component of the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership. So if we're going to have to speed up a bit, so if we're going to tell the origin story here, it is largely rooted in the We Rise Together report by the ICE committee, the Indigenous Circle of Experts. Stephen was on that committee. Another colleague of mine, Eli Enns, was co-chair with Danica Littlechild, who is here. And it just kind of happened that Stephen and Eli knew me from previous work, and so we started chatting around the time that this was being drafted, and we decided to apply for some SSHRC funding, and it's a particular kind of SSHRC funding. So this is the Social Science Humanities Research Council of Canada, in that it's not a typical research grant. It's one that allows and expects strategic direction and intellectual direction to come from outside the university. And it also means that a lot of money can be used for dialogues and for knowledge mobilization. It's not just pure kind of classic research. So it gave us the opportunity to kind of create something different. The objectives of the partnership are effectively to create a network for conservation through reconciliation. So this is recognizing that there's all sorts of excellent work being done across Canada. Research work, but organizations, conservation organizations, ENGOs, Indigenous nations who are already doing really good work. But what was missing was that network, the ability to communicate with each other, to leverage each other's expertise and money and resources. So that's largely what we're trying to accomplish here. And one of the lasting legacies of this should be the Canadian IPCA Alliance, which will be an alliance, an organization founded in an ethical space that helps all the IPCAs and folks working on IPCAs to be talking to each other. Ensuring ethical and collaborative learning and research in support of Indigenous-led conservation. And so this is really about creating a model of decolonial partnerships is the lasting legacy there, and I'll talk more specifically about what research looks like in this context in a minute. And then the third objective is increasing capacity amongst Indigenous nations, communities, the conservation sector, and the general public. A lot of you are already doing that work. So part of it's just about amplifying that work, and a lot of our partners are already doing that work. Some of it's about having dialogues like this one, especially for nations who don't have the capacity to create these dialogues themselves. Some of it's about restoring the Canadian conservation story. It's about creating curricular models for K through 12 in universities to get Canadians more comfortable and aware with the deep benefits of moving towards conservation that connects rather than separates. So the ultimate goal is to co-create products that go into the solutions bundle, which is an online portal for stories, documents, templates, guidance, videos, podcasts, et cetera, for people to access on their own journey in supporting Indigenous-led conservation in Canada, regardless of what part of society they come from. So our governance structures, so we have an Elders Lodge, which provides ethical oversight, ensures that we're working authentically, equitably, and understanding the sacredness of what we're trying to do, supporting two-eyed seeing, conflict resolution, consensus decision-making. That is only 4 people strong at the moment, so we're just coming to our first year anniversary. It's a 7-year project, and we've been kind of foundations building and governance. So they've been guiding governance. Larry McDermott, Algonquin, Albert Marshall, Mi'kmaq, Marilyn Capriol, who's Anishinaabe, and Paulette Fox, who's Blackfoot from Kainai First Nation, are that core right now. We're starting to build it out, and we'll also be adding youth. The leadership circle is sort of the intellectual and strategic direction of the partnership, budget oversight, reporting, implementation. And then we have founding partners and more partners that are coming on board who are really intentional about a reciprocal relationship, helping us with communications, knowledge mobilization, and contributions agreements. We support some of their work and help mobilize out some of their results. So these are drafts, but you can see that ethical space and two-eyed seeing are really core features of how we're trying to operate, and are intentional about that. And we've also tried to change our organizational structure to help facilitate this. So our work plan is circular. It's 7 years long. We try to be attentive to the seasonality in accordance with the 13 moons. These are principles that, while not universal, likely resonate with most Indigenous governance systems, and certainly at least allows us to be really intentional about not interfering with goose hunting season and things of this nature, right? We have a camp in each of those 4 seasons where we try to work on the land with each other in intergenerational working groups and move forward our collective work. So the leadership circle, Marilyn Baptiste, Eli Enns, Stephen Nita, Lisa Young, and 2 university partners, myself and Dr. Faisal Mullah. I come from a social science background, whereas Faisal is a conservation biologist by training. And we have a lot of founding partners. The hosts organizations are really the University of Guelph, who's put in about $1 million of their own money. SSHRC's put in about 2.5. Isak Alam Foundations, run by Eli Enns out in BC, and the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, of which Stephen is a part. Larry Innes, who's also helping us with policy research and legal research, is also involved. And then we have most major conservation organizations in the country have shown support, and they support the work, and they help mobilize some of our activities. So our objectives on research, well, the first one is really like, what the heck's Canada doing? Is it really advancing reconciliation and decolonization on the international stage as well as domestically? So we have a team of researchers that are like observing Canada as they negotiate the next 2020 targets, post-2020 targets, as well as turning that critical eye on ourselves. Supporting existing and proposed Indigenous conservation mechanisms. And a lot of that has to do with creating products that will hopefully be useful. So we have a team of folks looking at biocultural indicators and frameworks for measuring success and to make the business case of IPCAs, as an example. We also have some work helping individual nations, say, develop management plans for new IPCAs. And we're also trying to support the transformation of existing protected areas. And so that's about best practices of attempts that, say, Parks Canada is making and trying to disseminate some of those outwards so it's not such an uneven field in terms of how different nations have different kinds of agreements with, say, Parks Canada. There's a lot more to be said there, but not time. So that's our website, and it's kind of like a watch this space sort of comment. But I would say that you could email us if you want to get in touch, and Alison Bishop is here as well, and she helps run the partnership as our manager. We also have a social media presence, but I will say a few things specifically. So we're starting to people this resource this website and add a lot of things to it, so hopefully there'll be resources there that are helpful to you. But if you already have strong research relationships with university-based academics, I'd ask you to tell them about this, and they can get in touch. So hopefully we can support their work, or we can learn from the work that they're doing with you. If you already have students that are enrolled somewhere, undergrad, grad, whatever, and want to support the work that your nation is doing on conservation, have them contact us. We might be able to help support some of that work. If you have folks that want to pursue grad studies and haven't thought about it yet, again, contact us. We have agreements with University of Alberta, UVic, UBC, Guelph, Concordia, Dalhousie, York, and Trent University, all of whom have scholars that are proven community-based researchers who want to host students. And finally, if you're working with ENGOs or other conservation agencies that aren't already listed as a partner, or even the really big ones, even if they are, because they don't all talk to each other, tell them, get them to look at our website. We're starting to have resources that might be useful, newsletters, blogs, podcasts, and so on. And we also can leverage our money with my tax money to help support research needs of those organizations or of the nations that they're working with. So that's kind of where we're at right now, and I hope you do look at the website and get a sense of what we're up to, and then talk to myself, or put Stephen on the spot, because he's sitting right there, and Alison Bishop if you have any other questions. Okay. Thanks.